You could hear a pin drop until the furious voice of Charles Whitman, a wealthy Wall Street executive, thundered across his opulent Manhattan penthouse. "Where's my Rolex?" he barked, eyes blazing, scanning every inch of the room. His gaze quickly landed on Grace Turner, a composed 32-year-old cleaning professional who had been tidying up quietly in the background. Grace looked up, unshaken. "I don't know anything about a watch, Mr. Whitman," she replied, her voice calm but steady. But Charles wasn't interested in calm, he was interested in blame. "Of course you do," he snapped, stepping toward her, his tone thick with accusation. "You're the only one who's been in my closet today. A $50,000 Submariner doesn't just vanish." Grace clenched her cloth a little tighter. After 5 years working for elite home services, she'd dealt with her fair share of rude clients, but something about Charles's tone felt different this time. It wasn't just suspicion, it was personal. "If it helps, I'm happy to check my purse," she offered, still composed despite the sting of being doubted. Charles, fueled by arrogance and privilege, pulled out his phone. "And the police will be checking it too," he sneered. "People like you always try to take advantage of people like me." Just then a sharp wail cut through the air from the nursery. Grace turned her head. Charles' infant son was crying uncontrollably. But Charles didn't flinch. "The nanny handles that," he said. Grace, however, knew better, and instinctively she walked toward the sound. As Grace stepped into the nursery, the scene before her made her heart sink. Baby Olive, only 6 months old, lay alone in his crib, red-faced and soaked from a clearly soiled diaper. His cries were hoarse from what must have been hours of wailing. The nanny was nowhere to be seen. Grace's instincts took over. She softly approached, whispering gently to calm the distressed infant. Her years of caring for her nieces and nephews had taught her how to respond with a steady hand and a nurturing heart. She changed his diaper swiftly and cradled him in her arms. Almost instantly, Oliver stopped crying, his tiny body relaxing against her chest, as if he'd finally found safety. It was a moment of profound peace and proof of the emotional void surrounding the child. Just then, Charles barged in, his expression still stormy. "What the hell are you doing?" he demanded, cell phone in hand, his tone hovering between outrage and confusion. "Put my son down now." Without panic, Grace gently handed Oliver back to his father, but the result was immediate. The baby began screaming again, more frantically than before. Charles tried bouncing him, speaking softly, even pacing, but nothing worked. The harder he tried, the louder Oliver cried. Watching him struggle, Grace offered a quiet observation. "Babies pick up on tension. When adults are nervous or aggressive, they feel it." Her words struck a chord, and for a fleeting moment something shifted in Charles' expression. Was it curiosity? Guilt recognition? It was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced once again by scorn. "Oh, how convenient," he said bitterly. "The woman who's stolen my Rolex also happens to be a baby whisperer. Neat trick." Grace took a breath, determined not to retreat. She had dealt with her fair share of assumptions, prejudices, and sideways glances over the years, but this time was different. This was outright character assassination, and she wasn't going to let it slide. "Mr. Whitman," she said firmly, eyes level with his, "I did not take your watch. If you truly believe I did, I invite you to call the police. Let them check everything, my bag, my movements, even the building's security cameras." Charles faltered slightly, caught off guard by her directness. Grace continued without blinking. "Go ahead and call them. Let's do a full investigation. I've been in this apartment since 9 o'clock this morning and haven't stepped foot outside. Cameras in the lobby, hallways, and elevator will show that." And maybe, just maybe, they'll show you exactly where your watch really is. That quiet confidence in her voice began to gnaw at Charles. There was no fear in her eyes, no guilt in her posture. On the contrary, her composure was unnerving, as though she knew something he didn't. And indeed she did. What Charles didn't realize was that Grace Turner wasn't just a cleaning lady. Before moving to the U.S., she had spent 5 years working as a private investigator in Kingston, Jamaica. With a degree in criminology and ongoing studies in forensic psychology, Grace had taken cleaning jobs not out of desperation, but as a means to support her education. She had seen wealthy men like Charles Beforman, who wore expensive suits but carried cheap assumptions, and she had learned exactly how to protect herself from their kind. As Grace turned back to gathering her supplies, her calm movements told Charles something he wasn't ready to admit. This wasn't a woman easily intimidated. And for the first time that morning, Charles Whitman began to feel the faintest flicker of uncertainty. Not just about the missing Rolex, but about everything he thought he knew about the woman standing before him. Charles stood frozen for a moment, watching Grace move with such assuredness that it made his accusations feel hollow. But his ego, far too inflated to admit even the possibility of being wrong, kicked back in with venom. "Perfect," he sneered. "The more evidence, the better." He fired off a message to the elite housekeeping service demanding they suspend Grace immediately. "People like you," he added, loud enough to cut through the air, "always think you can get away with it." The words hit like a slapknot, because they were new to Grace, but because they were always the same. People like you, those coded, veiled attacks that somehow said everything without saying it directly. She slowly turned toward him, her tone calm but cutting. "What kind of person am I, Mr. Whitman?" The question silenced him. For the first time, Charles felt the ground shift under his feet. Then his phone buzzed. A message from his lawyer flashed across the screen. "Meeting canceled. Urgent family matter." He ignored it, laser-focused on crushing Grace. But Grace was already steps ahead. She packed her things with methodical precision and turned toward the door, but not before delivering one final blow. "I'd check your pockets, or maybe your car. Men like you tend to blame others for the messes they create themselves." That line lingered like a ghost as she walked out. Outside in the hallway, Grace dialed her sister. "Carmen, I need a favor," she said briskly. "Remember Detective Martinez? From my old unit in Kingston?" Carmen gasped. "Grace, are you in trouble?" "Not yet," Grace replied with a cool smile. "But someone else is about to be." What no one in that penthouse knew, least of all Charles, was that Grace had anticipated this exact moment. She'd been documenting everything. As soon as she began noticing red flag snide comments, unusual tension missing items conveniently found later, she knew she had to protect herself. So she did what any trained investigator would. She set up a protocol. Her phone had been recording from the moment she entered the apartment. Every accusation, every racist insinuation, every insult, it was all captured. 30 minutes later, Detective Martinez returned her call. "Grace Turner, my best trainee. What can I do for you?" Grace explained the situation, requesting access to the building's security footage and a quiet background check on Charles Whitman. 2 hours, Martinez promised. "Well, get everything." Meanwhile, Charles was still unraveling. The police had arrived thanks to his earlier threats, and were now asking uncomfortable questions. "So you're accusing your cleaning staff of theft, but you're not sure when or how the item went missing?" One officer asked, scribbling notes. "It's always on my nightstand," Charles insisted. Though the truth was murkier. His schedule had been erratic, and his memory foggy. That's when his phone buzzed again. His family lawyer. "Charles, for just got a strange inquiry. Someone's asking about your conduct's treatment of staff prior complaints. Are you under investigation?" The call dropped before Charles could respond. Back in the apartment, the officers received a message from the building's security team. Sir One said carefully, "We reviewed the footage. Your cleaning staff arrived at 9:00 a.m. sharp and hasn't left. You, however, were seen arriving late last night and dropping something metallic near your car." Moments later, the building's concierge brought a small bag. Inside it, the Rolex. Charles stared at it, stunned. It had been under his car the entire time, but the humiliation wasn't over. As Grace reviewed the footage with Martinez from a nearby cafe, the detective uncovered more. Charles had 3 prior lawsuits for racial discrimination, settled quietly, gag orders in place. His company was already under investigation for tax evasion. Grace Martinez said this man isn't just arrogant, he's crumbling. And Grace, armed with evidence and resolve, knew she was no longer just defending herself. She was about to dismantle a system that allowed men like Charles Whitman to feel invincible. While Charles Whitman attempted to regroup from the shock of finding his watch under his own car, Grace sat at a sunlit corner of a downtown cafe with Detective Martinez and Dr. Maya Williams, a renowned civil rights attorney. Grace hadn't come this far to simply prove her innocence. She wanted justice not just for herself, but for every domestic worker who had been falsely accused and too afraid or under-resourced to fight back. Grace Turner. Dr. Williams said, unfolding a thick dossier, "Your case is identical to 3 previous women who worked for Mr. Whitman. All black, all accused of misconduct, and all forced into silence by non-disclosure settlements." Grace's eyes narrowed, her calm demeanor now sharpened by a fierce clarity. "Then it's time someone breaks that silence." Detective Martinez tapped his tablet. "The building's security footage backs everything you said. It also shows Charles lying to the police about the timeline and tampering with his own story. That's enough to charge him with false reporting." But Grace wasn't finished. She'd come prepared, not just with audio from her phone, which had recorded every second of the confrontation, but with a strategy. "I've already contacted Channel 6 Investigative," she said. "They've agreed to run the story once we've reviewed all the evidence. No more backroom settlements. This time the public sees everything." Dr. Williams nodded approvingly. "If we present this right, it will not only clear your name, it will shift policies across this entire industry." Back at his penthouse, Charles was unraveling. His board of directors had called an emergency meeting. His wife Vanessa wasn't answering calls. His lawyer had gone silent. Then came the worst blow yet, a call from Channel 6 News requesting a comment on allegations of systematic discrimination. "We've received a complete timeline of your incident today," the reporter said, along with prior legal settlements that suggest a pattern. Charles hung up, his pulse racing. But the damage was already spreading like wildfire. On Twitter, hashtags like "Justice for Grace" and "Cleaners Deserve Respect" were trending. Influencers, community leaders, and even celebrities began sharing the developing story, calling out the systemic mistreatment of domestic workers. Meanwhile, Grace's evidence package reached the board of Whitman Holdings' Charles investment firm. The chairwoman, Elaine Park, reviewed the footage and transcripts with a grim expression. "This isn't just one bad moment. This is a documented pattern of discrimination and abuse of power." Within hours, Charles was suspended indefinitely. A press release followed announcing a full internal audit and distancing the company from the personal conduct of Mr. Whitman. Charles, watching the announcement from his now isolated apartment, felt the floor drop beneath him. Calls from clients stopped. Deals collapsed. His once glittering reputation was disintegrating before his eyes. But for Grace, the moment wasn't about vengeance. It was about truth. She met again with Dr. Williams and Detective Martinez to prepare for a formal civil rights complaint. "Well, reopen those previous cases," Maya said. "With your evidence and platform, we can protect others who suffered in silence." That night, Grace sat in her modest apartment, the city lights flickering beyond the window. Her phone buzzed with the messages other workers thanking her people, sharing their own experiences, law students asking for interviews. She felt something she hadn't in years: peace. Charles, meanwhile, found himself alone in his apartment, staring at the very watch that had set this all in motion. It no longer felt valuable. It felt like a symbol of everything he had taken for granted: his power, his wealth, his entitlement. In his arrogance, he had mistaken silence for inferiority, calmness for weakness. He didn't realize that the woman he tried to humiliate had walked into his home armed with knowledge, strategy, and an unbreakable sense of self. Now, as his empire cracked beneath him, Charles began to understand the real cost of prejudice, not just the lawsuits or public shame, but the irreversible loss of respect, dignity, and purpose. And Grace, she was just getting started. The fallout from Charles Whitman's actions only deepened as the days passed. By the time Friday rolled around, Grace Turner had transformed from a wrongly accused cleaning lady into a lightning rod for national attention. The Channel 6 expos had gone viral overnight, sparking outrage across social media and mainstream media alike. Viewers watched in disbelief as full audio recordings played of Charles accusing Grace, mocking her dignity, and ultimately being proven wrong by security footage and investigative evidence. But while Charles sulked in his penthouse, Grace was stepping onto an entirely new pathone that had been quietly paved by years of resilience and preparation. What the world didn't know, and what Channel 6 soon revealed, was that Grace wasn't just a cleaner. Before coming to the U.S., she had worked for nearly a decade as a private investigator in Kingston, Jamaica. She held degrees in criminology and forensic psychology credentials that would surprise anyone who had only ever seen her in a cleaning uniform. When asked why she had taken a job as a domestic worker, Grace responded with characteristic calm. Because survival isn't beneath dignity, and because I wanted to protect myself and others while I studied for my license here. Her words resonated deeply, especially with marginalized women who had long been told their value was defined by the work they were allowed to do. In the aftermath of the public scandal, Charles' life continued its downward spiral. His senior partner Marcus sent a terse email notifying him that multiple contracts had been canceled due to serious reputational risk. The board chair Elaine Park called a vote to terminate him permanently, an outcome that passed unanimously. Legal notices followed a lawsuit from Grace for defamation and false accusation, and another from a coalition of former employees who had faced similar treatment. Charles' lawyer advised him to settle immediately, warning that the evidence Grace possessed, especially the audio and footage, would devastate him in court. "You've lost this fight," the attorney said bluntly. "Settle, apologize, and disappear." But Grace wasn't interested in a quiet settlement. "I don't want hush money," she told Dr. Maya Williams, her attorney. "I want change. I want this to mean something for every worker who comes after me." Together, they launched a civil rights case that gained traction in Washington, with lawmakers and labor advocates using it as a case study for systemic discrimination in high-income households. The Department of Labor opened a formal investigation into Elite Cleaning Services client history. Meanwhile, nonprofit organizations began inviting Grace to speak at events about workers' rights, racial equity, and self-advocacy. Invitations from podcasts, television interviews, and community panels poured in. Grace was no longer cleaning houses, she was cleaning up injustice. Yet through it all, she remained grounded. Her first act, with the money raised through donations and speaking engagements, was to establish the Turner Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to offering legal and emotional support to domestic workers facing mistreatment. The Foundation's first initiative, free legal workshops on how to document and report workplace abuse safely. Grace knew that not everyone had her training or resources, but she could give them the tools they needed to fight back. She also began working with legislators on a bill that would require mandatory bias training for employers hiring domestic workers through agencies, ensuring no one else would face what she had endured. And Charles, his penthouse, was sold within weeks to cover mounting legal fees. His assets were frozen, pending multiple investigations, one from the IRS, another from the Civil Rights Commission. His wife Vanessa filed for divorce and took their son, citing emotional instability and public disgrace. He moved into a modest rental on the outskirts of the city, where the neighbors recognized him only as the man from that news story. Occasionally, he'd still see Grace's name pop upon billboards, news headlines, and inspirational posts. Every time it reminded him of the question he once asked, dripping with arrogance: "What harm can a cleaning lady do to me?" Now the answer echoed louder than ever. The harm wasn't in destruction, it was in the rebuilding. Grace didn't ruin Charles. He did that all by himself. All she did was refuse to stay silent. By the start of the next month, Grace Turner's rise was no longer just a story. It was a movement. The Turner Foundation had exploded in reach and recognition, attracting national partners, corporate sponsors, and human rights organizations eager to support its mission. Grace's poise and fierce intellect had captivated people far beyond the cleaning services industry. Civil rights attorney Dr. Maya Williams described her as a modern-day Rosa Parks for domestic workers, a title that Grace humbly accepted not for glory, but for responsibility. Her life had become a balancing act between leading investigations, mentoring young women of color, entering the workforce, and continuing her own educational journey in forensic psychology. But the more she grew into the public eye, the more resistance she faced. Not from her past, but from powerful figures still clinging to the old status quo. Several ultra-wealthy homeowners, who had once employed domestic workers through elite cleaning services, began pushing back, releasing tone-deaf public statements claiming that employees should be grateful, not suspicious. One even referred to Grace's campaign as a witch hunt wrapped in virtue. But these statements only emboldened the movement. Activists organized peaceful protests outside agencies that failed to protect workers, while others flooded social media with the hashtag Grace turned the tables. Domestic workers, once silent and invisible, began to share their stories, their pain, and their victories. Grace made it a point to amplify each one through Turner Foundation's online platform, creating a digital archive of testimonials that journalists and legal teams could access to investigate systemic issues in the industry. Meanwhile, Charles Whitman was battling a very different reality. The same man who once stood atop a financial empire was now living in a two-bedroom rental on the city's outskirts, barely scraping by on short-term consulting gigs that paid a fraction of his former salary. He rarely showed his face in public. Any mention of his name in the press was almost always accompanied by the phrases disgraced executive or former investment partner. His fall from grace was so complete that business schools began including his story in ethics courses under the cautionary module Consequences of Corporate Prejudice. Still, Charles refused to let go of his resentment. From the shadows, he hired a private PR consultant to launch a smear campaign, leaking half-truths and manipulated narratives to fringe blogs in an effort to discredit Grace. Claims that she had fabricated her credentials, manipulated footage, or orchestrated the entire scenario for fame started to surface. But Grace had built her empire on truth, and she had documented everything. Within 72 hours of the first smear articles appearing, Dr. Williams held a press conference, not only debunking every lie, but also announcing a defamation lawsuit against the sites and the individuals funding them. Cybersecurity specialists traced the campaign back to a proxy firm linked to one of Charles' old shell companies. The evidence was irrefutable. When law enforcement got involved, Charles was once again summoned, this time for violating ethical guidelines surrounding online harassment and tampering with an ongoing civil investigation. The judge, already familiar with Charles' previous history, denied him bail pending trial. As he sat in the holding cell, surrounded by silence and steel, Charles finally realized that he hadn't been destroyed by Grace, he had been exposed by her. Every choice he made to demean her, every insult, every assumption had only accelerated his descent. Grace hadn't ruined him. She had simply shined a light where he had worked so hard to cast shadows. Back at the Turner Foundation, Grace addressed her growing staff at their newly opened regional headquarters. Her voice was steady, resolute. "This movement isn't just about me," she said. "It's about every woman who was told to stay quiet. It's about every worker who was treated like they were disposable. We're not disposable. We're indispensable." Her words ignited applause, but more than that, they ignited purpose. The room was filled with women, many of whom had once cleaned homes like Charles now, serving as investigators, advocates, and leaders. Grace stood at the helm not as a victim of injustice, but as its conqueror. And she knew this was just the beginning. 2 months after Charles Whitman's final attempt to smear her name failed, Grace Turner stood in front of a packed auditorium at the National Conference on Labor Rights and Social Equity. The room buzzed with anticipation. Civil rights leaders, legal scholars, and corporate executives all gathered to hear her speak, not just as a symbol of resilience, but as an architect of reform. Behind her was a banner that read, "Power through Truth, Transforming Injustice into Impact." Grace approached the podium, her signature calm smile in place, and began not with a speech, but with a story about a young Jamaican woman with a criminology degree who once scrubbed marble floors while listening to boardroom meetings through walls thin as paper. The crowd sat in reverent silence, hanging on to every word, as she traced her path from invisible housekeeper to nationally recognized investigator and advocate. What they didn't know yet was that Grace was about to unveil a bold initiative that would shake the corporate world yet again. With the backing of Dr. Maya Williams and several legal partners, she announced the launch of the Turner Certification Program, a new accreditation standard for companies and households employing domestic workers. The certification would require anti-discrimination training, ethical treatment policies, and independent auditing for every employer who wished to be recognized as a fair labor partner. It was groundbreaking, and it had teeth. Companies found to be non-compliant would be added to a public watch list that would be accessible to hiring agencies, advocacy groups, and government watchdogs. The announcement sent immediate ripples through the business community. Reputable companies scrambled to meet the requirements, eager to avoid the PR fallout of being labeled unethical employers. Within weeks, dozens of agencies and even luxury apartment complexes began integrating the certification into their hiring processes. For domestic workers, this wasn't just policy, it was power. They now had a legitimate framework to demand respect backed by enforceable standards. Back in his apartment, Charles watched the live stream of Grace's announcement with a cocktail glass trembling slightly in his hand. The once towering executive now lived a life of obscurity, sustained by dwindling savings and online freelance work. His eyes, hollowed from months of sleepless nights, stared at the screen as Grace confidently laid out a blueprint for change, one he never saw coming. She hadn't just survived the storm he tried to unleash, she'd built a new world from it. Despite his pride, Charles couldn't help but feel something unfamiliar bubbling in his chest. Not anger, but regret. Not just for what he had lost, but for how little he had ever seen in the woman who now stood as a beacon of justice. When he muttered the words, "She's just a cleaning lady," he had no idea that cleaning would become a metaphor for what she would do to the system he thought untouchable. In the weeks that followed, Grace continued her work with quiet determination. The Turner Foundation opened satellite offices in 3 more cities, and Grace testified before a congressional subcommittee on labor justice. Her insights were included in proposed legislation aimed at protecting undocumented workers from workplace abuse, a cause she had championed long before her own rise. But the real moment of transformation came not from a speech or a lawsuit, but a handwritten letter. It arrived one morning with no return address, bearing the shaky handwriting of a man broken by consequence. "Dear Ms. Turner, I write not to beg forgiveness, but to acknowledge the truth. You taught me that power without decency is nothing. I once asked what harm a cleaning lady could do. I now understand. You didn't harm me, you revealed me. For what it's worth, I'm sorry, C.W." Grace folded the letter carefully, not out of sentiment, but out of understanding. She never needed an apology. What she needed, and what she fought for, was change. And change had come not just for her, but for thousands of others who had once been invisible. The movement she started was no longer about one injustice. It was a tide no one could stop. As the auditorium emptied and reporters packed up their cameras, Grace Turner lingered for a moment on stage, gazing at the rows of empty chairs. In each seat, she imagined a face. Someone who once felt small, overlooked, or wrongly accused. That night, back in her modest office with a panoramic view of the city she once cleaned for, she opened her inbox and found hundreds of messages. One stood out. "Because of your story, I stood up to my supervisor today. I didn't back down. Thank you for showing me how." Grace smiled, not for the recognition, but because she knew this was the real legacy empowerment rippling outward. Her journey had not been one of revenge, but of redemption. She had turned suspicion into reform, humiliation into hope, and silence into strength. What began as an accusation over a missing watch had become a catalyst for labor reform, corporate accountability, and human dignity. The woman once dismissed as just a cleaning lady had shown the world that when you combine truth with courage, you don't just win, you change the game. Never underestimate the quiet strength of someone with nothing left to lose, but everything to fight for. True power doesn't come from status or wealth. It comes from knowing your worth and standing firm when others try to erase it. If Grace's story inspired you to think twice about how we treat others, especially those we overlook, leave a comment below, share your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that reveal the real power of resilience, truth, and justice.